Okay, let's unpack this. Think about the standard story of history we're all taught. The comfortable one.
Hmm.
It's a straight line, right? We start simple, we invent fire, learn agriculture, we build Rome, have the Enlightenment, and now here we are, standing at the very top of this constant, inevitable progress.
That linear progression, that triumphal march,
Hmm.
it's absolutely central to how we see ourselves.
It is.
But our sources for this deep dive suggest that this standard history is less an accurate record and more of a story we've designed to, well, to flatter our own position in it.
Right.
The core idea is that constant upward progress is a psychological assumption. It's frankly irresistible to us, but it's just not supported by the complete data.
Exactly. So we are diving into what these sources call the human cycle theory, and it completely inverts that standard view.
Mm.
It posits that civilization isn't some guaranteed destiny.
Or an ultimate achievement.
Yeah, no. It's a temporary, recurring metabolic phase of the species. And collapse, far from being this huge tragedy or an anomaly, is simply normal. We're just the latest version of a very old, very repetitive experiment.
So the mission for us and for you is to build the intellectual foundation you need to even see this cycle. We have to clear away the myths.
The flattering lies.
The flattering lies, yeah. The ones we use to protect our own sense of superiority and then confront the reality of our position. You're going to get a shortcut into understanding why our confidence in inevitable progress is psychologically necessary, but, well, archaeologically impossible to prove.
So let's start with just the sheer magnitude of our ignorance. I mean, we have to confront the first fundamental challenge to that linear view, and it's rooted in survivorship bias in archaeology.
It's a brutal reality check for anyone who studies deep history. Archaeology is, is constrained by what the Earth preserves.
And the Earth is a very efficient eraser.
An exceptionally efficient eraser, yeah. The things that survive that 10,000-year time scale are typically stone, certain kinds of ceramic, and bone. And that's usually only under very rare, very specific geological conditions.
But just think about everything that defines a modern, advanced civilization. Our global infrastructure, high-tech manufacturing, metals, electronics, all are engineered materials.
Our entire written record on paper or silicon.
All of it. It all degrades, and it degrades really, really fast.
So if you could jump forward 10,000 years, an anthropologist wouldn't find a cohesive picture of New York or London.
Not a chance.
You'd find a huge amount of unrecognizable rubble. Maybe some ambiguous concrete foundations, vast fossil fuel residue, sure. But the narrative coherence of our civilization, the purpose of those things, would be completely gone.
Which means the core error we make today is this. We look at the surviving scraps of past cultures, some pottery, a few stone tools, and we treat that lack of preserved complexity as evidence of the limits of that culture.
Instead of what it really is.
Right. Instead of acknowledging it's just evidence of the limits of geological preservation, the absence of preserved high technology isn't proof that advanced systems didn't exist. It's just proof that the Earth erases almost everything made of metal, wood, and organic stuff.
And this preservation problem feeds directly into what the sources call the illusion of beginnings.
I found this part fascinating.
It's because our minds crave narrative. They crave order. So when archaeologists find the earliest megalithic structures or the oldest preserved city walls, we reflexively slap the label "the beginning" on it.
It satisfies that human need for an origin point, right?
Precisely. But the material we looked at argues this label is almost always an inference based on absence. Since entire cycles of civilization are, continually metabolized by the Earth, the earliest preserved evidence we find is almost certainly not the true starting point.
It's just the first one that lasted.
It is merely the first surviving layer of many, many buried cycles. By labeling it the beginning, we actively protect that linear model. It lets us maintain the comforting story that humanity started with simple cavemen and progressed directly, without any interruption, straight to us.
And to really grasp the scale of this blind spot, we have to look at the timeline. This is what the sources call the 250,000-year gap.
Yeah.
Modern humans, Homo sapiens, we've been around for at least 250,000, maybe 300,000 years. That's a massive span of time.
And yet, the continuous archaeological record, the record that gives us detailed, reliable data about human activity, permanent settlement, complexity, that only really begins around 10,000 years ago, after the last big glacial maximum.
That is just a staggering number. Do the math. Over 95% of our species' entire existence is archaeologically invisible to us.
It creates this profound sense of security that's based on totally incomplete data. The source material gives this really startling analogy.
The book one.
Yeah. If human existence were a 100-page book, All our confident claims about first civilizations
Hmm.
are based on reading only the last 4 pages. And we just assume those last 4 pages tell the whole story.
But the history in the missing 96 pages is simply gone,
Mm,
unknowable.
unknowable.
So, okay, if the data is so sparse and the theory is so compelling, why the academic resistance? Why does this cyclical model stay on the fringe?
Well, it really boils down to two forces: institutional inertia and, I think more importantly, psychological discomfort.
Ah.
I mean, think about it. Entire academic fields, funding bodies, museum collections, they're all built on the assumption that recorded history is all of history. Challenging that linear foundation doesn't just destabilize a theory, it destabilizes entire careers, entire disciplines.
And on the personal level, it forces us to confront a really unsettling idea.
Absolutely.
If we aren't the first, then progress isn't guaranteed. Civilization is not some inevitable outcome. It's a repeating ecological experiment that has failed countless times.
The linear story is fundamentally the most flattering lie available because it gives us a sense of superiority, of inevitability, and this belief that collapse is a moral failure that we can avoid.
Unlike those primitive people before us.
Exactly. To admit that collapse is a systemic feature, a natural consequence of certain decisions. It's just too destabilizing for the modern worldview. And that's the first pillar of the theory, just recognizing that blind spot.
That's a huge shift in perspective. So, okay, if the physical evidence is missing or misleading, we have to look inward at the architecture of the mind itself. Let's pivot from the archaeological problem to the cognitive one.
Yes,
The sources argue that civilizations collapse not because they lack intelligence, but because intelligence itself follows these predictable, self-sabotaging patterns.
exactly. We have to treat consciousness not as some philosophical ideal, but as a biological system. It's a pattern recognition engine, and it's optimized for survival. And this system is profoundly constrained by energy.
And here's the core, uncomfortable truth the sources point to. The mind doesn't privilege truth. It privileges useful illusion to compress complexity. If our nervous system had to process the full, chaotic, moment-to-moment complexity of reality, we would collapse under the metabolic load. We invent structure, we invent categories, we invent stability, even where it doesn't exist, if it helps us survive right now.
And this cognitive optimization is steered by what the sources define as the twin universal evolutionary drivers. These are the non-negotiable forces that structure all human behavior.
The first is energy minimization, which really just translates into convenience. Organisms fundamentally optimize for the lowest metabolic cost.
Right.
Nomadism, with its constant movement, was eventually replaced by settlement, not because it was ethically or morally superior, but just because it was more convenient. Predictable calories, less movement, less energy spent right away.
And the second driver is fear minimization, which translates into comfort. Fear is metabolic energy spent on uncertainty. So civilization, when you strip away all the culture and the art, is a massive, complex structure engineered to suppress fear.
Fear of starvation, fear of predators, fear of exposure.
All of it. Comfort is just the successful, large-scale suppression of risk.
I see that everywhere. It's why we invent elaborate financial regulations, global supply chains, enormous security systems. We're building these massive infrastructures designed solely to tell our nervous system, it's okay, you don't have to worry about this today.
And when these two drivers intersect with our symbolic ability, it inevitably leads to a split in our thinking. We see adaptive cognition, which is reality-based, feedback-driven, and it thrives when survival pressure is high. That's the cognition of resilient nomadic life.
But then you get delusional cognition, which is model-based, symbol-driven, comfort-seeking. And this is where it gets really interesting, because delusional cognition is the cognition of abundance.
It emerges precisely when the system is so successful, so stable, that it protects individuals from the consequences of their own bad predictions.
So you can be totally divorced from reality.
Completely.
Yeah.
You can have no idea how your food arrived or how your water is purified or how fragile the electric grid is and still survive perfectly well because the system absorbs your error.
Can you give me a tangible example of that modern delusion?
Sure. Think about modern industrial agriculture.
Yeah.
We've optimized calorie output through monocultures, pesticides, complex logistics. That's convenience maximized. But the delusion is believing that this system, which depends on global petroleum, stable borders, highly specialized machinery, that it's permanent.
Ah.
Adaptive cognition would see the fragility. Delusional cognition only sees the shelf full of cheap food. Civilizations collapse, the sources say, when that layer of symbolic order becomes so energetically expensive to maintain that reality just overrides the ideology.
And this gets accelerated by symbolic thinking and myth compression. Symbols are vital for coordination, but they degrade over time, like a multi-generational game of telephone.
Transmission mutates the message. Practical, real-world survival knowledge, say, ecological insights or sustainable land use, it slowly turns into literalized metaphors. Rigid religious texts, gods demanding specific sacrifices, cosmic cycles that you have to adhere to. The symbolic drift is just the predictable thermodynamics of cultural memory.
It turns functional knowledge into rigid, self-reinforcing delusion.
Divorced from ecological feedback. Yes.
And the sources are so clear on this. Reasoning itself does not evolve, it just reiterates. The tools we use, our inputs, our information, they improve dramatically, but the underlying cognitive engine that processes that data is ancient. It's fundamentally unchanged.
Which means the same thinking machinery that built our current civilization could have built and then dismantled previous cycles.
So intelligence in this context doesn't guarantee survival.
No, it's the mechanism that accelerates collapse once symbolic delusion replaces ecological reality.
Yeah.
And that acceleration brings us to the cycle's physical beginning, the transition from mobility to permanence.
This is where we see the origins of systemic fragility. All civilizations, according to this model, they start and end as nomads. The entire arc between those two poles is the story of the rise of human inequality.
Yes. Civilization emerges from excess, and as the sources state bluntly, excess is the mother of inequality.
Let's look at the egalitarian mechanics of nomadic life. This part was really eye-opening.
Egalitarianism isn't a moral choice or an ideology for nomadic groups. It's a biological necessity enforced by physics. Mobility prevents resource hoarding.
Right. You can't claim land, you can't defend possessions when you're constantly traveling. Everyone has to contribute equal labor, or the whole group fails.
And that enforced equality leads to what they call survival reproduction. In that model, any male who contributes labor and survives long enough gets to reproduce. This preserves genetic diversity because the selection pressure is ecological. It's stamina, awareness, resilience.
But settlement instantly disrupts all of this. It introduces selective reproduction.
The moment permanence happens, resources concentrate. Land, grain, water, it's all stored. And stored resources require control. So reproduction is no longer gated by survival contribution.
It's gated by resource control, by social status.
Exactly. And that concentration of power and resources is the root of social inequality. It immediately leads to genetic bottlenecks and reduced diversity within that settled population. It perfectly illustrates this universal pattern. Resource abundance leads directly to hierarchy formation.
The key insight being that abundance isn't shared equally.
Never. Abundance is stored. Stored abundance needs guards, it needs planners, it needs owners. This immediately creates a surplus, which fuels specialization, which solidifies hierarchy, and ultimately it leads to asymmetrical mating opportunities. This is the crucial quote to remember. Abundance does not create equality. Abundance creates inequality.
And we have astonishing genetic evidence for this, confirming this exact structural shift. Starting with the rise of agriculture about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, female reproduction stayed relatively stable across populations. But male reproductive diversity collapsed dramatically, to the point where genetic data suggests as few as 1 in 17 males were successfully passing on their genes during this period.
That is the biological signature of the upper class monopolizing reproduction. The selection pressure shifts from selecting for ecological awareness and stamina, the traits of a survivor, to selecting for those who are highly specialized in hierarchy, navigation, and control.
You select for the specialist, the bureaucrat, the abstract thinker.
Often at the expense of general resilience.
Yes. But wait, isn't that a bit reductive? I mean, doesn't the very intelligence that created agriculture offer us tools that previous cycles lacked, tools to break that cycle?
It creates the tools, absolutely, but it simultaneously introduces the fragility paradox of agriculture. Agriculture creates sedentism, dependence on fragile, high-yield monocultures, centralized storage, a single point of failure, and massive population overshoot beyond the local carrying capacity.
So each of those components is a massive increase in systemic vulnerability.
A massive increase.
So the paradox really is, the more advanced the system becomes, the more vulnerable it is. We get very smart at maximizing one input calories, but we completely forget how to survive without the full, complex infrastructure required to deliver that one input.
Exactly. When the population exceeds the ecological carrying capacity, the fixed geography and the dependence on just one or two grain types means the next ecological shock, a drought, a pathogen, a flood, leads inevitably to collapse. It's a thermodynamic inevitability.
Not a moral failure.
Not a moral failure. It's driven by system complexity and population density.
And this process creates an evolutionary fork. On one side, you have the resilient tribal humans, the nomadic or rural populations selected for small group cohesion, mobility, deep ecological awareness.
And on the other, the settled humans. Infrastructure-dependent populations selected for navigating complex hierarchies and abstract reasoning that's divorced from ecological reality.
They aren't primitive versus advanced.
No, they are two ends of a repeating cycle. The settled populations accelerate technological growth and complexity, but they do so at the cost of biological and psychological fragility. It perfectly sets the system up for its inevitable reset, back toward the nomadic baseline.
This deep dive into the human cycle theory has been fascinating. We've covered the three foundational concepts: the archaeological blind spot that hides the past, the cognitive drive for useful illusion or delusion, and the systemic fragility caused by stored abundance and subsequent radical inequality.
Civilization isn't a destination.
It's a metabolic phase of the species.
That's it. The moment humans store food, hierarchy emerges. The moment that hierarchy accelerates complexity to the point where adaptability declines, collapse becomes structurally inevitable. Recognizing that archaeological blind spot is the essential first step to accepting the full cyclical model.
So the linear history we love is just
The residue of psychological comfort and institutional inertia.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to consider, based entirely on the source material we've looked at today. If reasoning itself does not evolve, it simply reiterates. And if the same cognitive machinery that built our current civilization built and then dismantled previous cycles, what verifiable evidence do we have that our current level of intelligence is doing anything other than accelerating our own specific phase of delusion?
History suggests intelligence optimizes system complexity, but it certainly does not guarantee survival.